Currently, we are debating public power. Our next one is going to be the road to net zero, details to come a little bit later, even by the end of this presentation. We're also looking at things like maybe talking about sustainable food, and we have a ton of other great ideas kind of brewing around, but we'd love to hear input from the rest of you guys and what you want to see before we finalize some of these final topics. So make sure to reach out to us and let us know if there's any topic or any climate policy that you're really interested in bringing to the table and discussing as the Sunrise cohort. So the goal of this is to vote on a general platform to provide for our endorsed candidates by May 30th, which is a couple weeks before actually voting, so they can put that out to their constituents and campaign on it. After that, we're looking at maybe forming some more detailed action committees where we can dive into the specifics of each given policy.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. Thanks, Natalie. Forum agenda, and this is going to be the general format for all of our forums, is we're going to start with about 25-ish minutes of topic. Our first two topics are going to be kind of lumped together, given by the lovely Matthew Sheridan, talking about the problems with private power and a general explanation of electricity. Buckle your seatbelts, guys. It's going to get pretty complicated. And then we are going to talk about DSA's public power bill. We have Stephen Fox here to join us as well. Thank you, Stephen. Then we're going to talk about the pros of public power. That's going to be Andrew. And then we're going to talk about maybe some downsides of public power. And that's from me. Then you're going to go into breakout rooms. That's going to be 10 minutes. In your breakout rooms, you're going to debate whether or not public power, not the DSA bill, but public power in general, is the option Sunrise should support. And you're going to create a list of questions with your groups to explore those questions further. Then we're going to come back. We're going to open it up. We're going to talk about it. We're going to wrap it up and talk about what comes next. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and throw your note-taking document into the chat here because everybody needs to open it up and be taking notes as we go. Some of it's going to get pretty dense. So make a copy, start taking notes. So when you get into your breakout rooms, nothing is a surprise. We've got some little prompts down here for you to continue to think about as we're going through the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to give him about 7 minutes total. You have Matt. Matt, I'm going to set a timer and you let me know when I need to advance my slides.
Oh, thank you for the wonderful introduction, Hillary. This is super exciting. We're going to get into the weeds on electricity markets and talk about public power. Yeah, there we go. So we care about the electric grid because power plants are sited in impoverished communities and utilities are funded through a regressive mechanism that charges the poor as much as they charge the rich. We need to generate clean electricity to stop climate change, and we need to make electricity more cost effective with fossil fuels. Next slide. So electricity prices vary all around the country. In New York, we're paying one of the most expensive electricity prices in the nation. In the center of the country, they're a lot cheaper. There's lots of reasons for this. Some of them are based on market design. Some of them are some fundamentals having to do with the geography of that region. Next slide. So the tiles got messed up here. So electricity costs what it does for two main reasons. We have to run a power plant and we have to maintain power lines. Some power plants are really cheap to run, such as hydropower. You install a turbine in a river and the water does all the work. Some are more complicated, like nuclear power. You have to have a whole team operating it. Some are subsidized, like fossil fuel plants, they can pollute without charging for it. So, ends up being cheaper. Likewise, some power lines are easy to access. These above ground power lines, the utility companies can easily repair them. Where the underground ones have to be dug up and replaced. Some areas have lots of hurricanes, so you're constantly replacing the power lines every time a hurricane or natural disaster comes through, and that jacks up the cost of electricity. Next slide. Con Edison mostly maintains power lines in New York City. They're legally not allowed to own power plants except for those that generate steam for their district steam system. So when we think of New York City utilities, we're going to think of the people who maintain the power lines and connect to your building. Next slide. NYC buries its lines underground. This was a requirement because the streets in NYC used to look insane. There were just wires running around everywhere. Now they have to dig up the road and engage in a super complicated process, but they do it to add more resiliency, and we have one of the most reliable grids in the country. Next slide. So this is one of my old electricity bills. You'll have supply charges, which is actually paying the power plants to run. And you have delivery charges. This is maintaining wires, connecting your building, and having Con Ed run this whole process. As you can see from my old apartment, the supply charges were cheaper than delivery charges, 9 cents a kilowatt hour versus 11 cents. The supply charges are mostly determined by the New York Independent System Operator. They are an organization with a big control room. They get to decide which power plants run, when to cut load if there's a risk of a blackout. Every type of power plant, nuclear, solar, hydro, gas, oil, gets to bid into the electricity market. And then the ISO determines how many power plants are needed, and then they pick all the cheapest ones. At the same time, you have different regions in New York based upon transmission line capacity. So we have all the hydropower plants up north in the near the Great Lakes that are really cheap, but that power can't be sent all the way to Long Island because there isn't enough power lines. So by the time you get to Long Island, you actually have to run power plants on the Long Island side, usually dirty, expensive oil peakers. And as a result, the electricity tends to be more expensive on that side. Next slide. A practical consequence of this is we have really clean energy upstate and we have really dirty energy downstate. And that 29% is going to go down even more with the closure of Indian Point. So we have to build more transmission, and there's a very big transmission constraint in the middle of the state. Next slide. So that's how the supply section of your bill is determined. Some entities can selectively buy supply. So, a main entity you might be familiar with, they'll come up in the bill, is the New York Power Authority, NYPA. Some consider them a utility. They're not the traditional utility in the same way Con Ed is, but they generate cheap hydropower, and they're allowed to only sell it to government agencies. So the MTA, Freeport Electric, some schools, they get really cheap power and they sell it to them, so they have really cheap bills. Likewise, Con Edison buys electricity, but they're not allowed to generate it and they have to sell it right to you. You can bypass Con Edison through an energy service company. This is called an ESCO. Some names you might have heard of are Green Mountain Energy and Direct Energy. They buy wind and solar, and they sell you the renewable energy credit, so you can get claimed to the wind and solar that's generated around the state. Doesn't necessarily affect the electrons that get to your house very much, but it does give those power plants a little bit more money that increases their profitability. Next slide. Every year, the utility company, like Con Edison, is going to determine how much they spent on maintaining power lines each year, and then ask the Public Service Commission, can they charge more for electricity? The Public Service Commission, they exist in most states. They're in charge with regulating electricity prices. They will grant an increase through this thing called a rate case, and we usually see electricity prices going up. Additionally, reliability councils will exist in most states, and they'll determine what generation do you need for this each area. So they actually say New York City has to have so much electricity generation capacity within New York City based upon available transmission, and that's why we have peaker plants. Next slide. There are two types of electricity markets. There's ones that we call traditionally regulated. They are the gray areas on the map. All that means is that the utility is completely vertically integrated. So the utility owns the generation, the transmission, and the distribution of electricity to your customers. Some people had issue with this. They're like, hey, I own a power plant. Why can't I sell to the grid? The utility was like, I'm the utility. I'm the only one that can do it. So in the 2000s, we underwent this thing called deregulation, which basically means there's a marketplace for wholesale power. So in the areas with the different colors on the map, each have independent system operators that manage a electricity marketplace, so non-utility entities can sell power on the grid. And now the power plants are run by non-utilities, and Con Edison had to sell off all of its power plants. Next slide. So now we have two things. We have a consumer-owned utility versus an investor-owned utility. An investor-owned utility is owned by shareholders. Their goal is to make a profit for their shareholders. A type of consumer-owned utility is public power, where the municipality or a public utility district will be elected to run the utility. So you can have a deregulated energy market with a public power entity. Such an example is CPS Energy from San Antonio. You can also have a traditionally regulated area with an investor-owned utility, like El Paso Electric, which is also in Texas. I'm also in Texas right now, so I'm thinking about the blackouts that happen quite a lot. Next
All right,
slide.
just FYI, your time is up. So you get like 60 seconds to make a final statements.
Okay, I think I only had one slide left. Let's see. Yeah, we can skip this slide. I want to do the Con Ed slide, and the slide after it'll take like 30 seconds. So yeah, Con Edison is actually six different entities. Two of them are considered regulated utilities in a deregulated area in New York, Con Edison in New York and Orange and Rockland Utilities. Con Edison Energy is their division that owns power plants, and then Con Edison Transmission owns lines. And then the next slide, you'll just see all the utilities that exist in New York, and there's a few pockets of public power. So you got 7 major utilities.
Cool. Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks for bringing that back. Next, we have Steve Fox talking about the DSA power bill. Steve, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and then you'll have your final 60 seconds to appeal. Are you ready? Are you here?
All right. Well, I guess we'll just go one by one real quick. So let's start with the Utility Democracy Act. Now, as Matt mentioned, there's 2 aspects of the grid. Well, it's more than that, but the 2 big things is we have generation and then we have distribution. When we think of Con Ed, we're talking about a distribution utility. Now, the New York Utility Democracy Act would specifically focus on distribution. Next slide, please. So yeah, basically what we need to do is we need to map out the entirety of the grids in New York and kind of figure out how, if we were to bring them under public control, we would divide them up and make them into other democratic, locally based utilities. The concept is to take the profit motive outside of the distribution utility game and allow money that's generated through those utilities to be reinvested directly into the grid, and also to have a democratic control of the grid as far as how they're overseen. So instead of having some far off investor-owned board controlling the utility, you would have a locally based, democratic, accountable board overseeing that aspect of the grid. Let's go ahead to next one. Let's just skip over all the details because we only have a couple minutes. So I'm just going to try to give the high end of this. So yeah, basically what it does is we're going to remove the profit motive. We are going to bring in a new rate structure. Right now, the way that we structure the rates is kind of like a regressive tax, where the lowest consumers actually proportionally pay more. We'd like to alter that. There's more details in here that I need to go into, so we'll just go into the next one. We also wanted to figure out how we can systematically upgrade our infrastructure. We want to make sure that we put ourselves into a place where we're able to expand electrification, maximize efficiency, and slowly but surely phase out natural gas. Next one. So that would be for the distribution, side of things. Now let's talk about the generation side of things. The second bill, which is the New York Build Public Renewables Act. Basically, what it does is, now we mentioned NYPA. NYPA currently is the nation's biggest public utility already. It basically owns like all of our big dams and things like that, and some other assets as well. Theoretically, it can do a lot of things with the amount of bond issuance powers it has. Unfortunately, we kind of tie its hands back. A couple of decades ago, we decided that they couldn't develop new electricity without very, very strict guidelines around it. And specifically, they can't generate new renewable energy. So what we'd want to do is we'd allow them to be unrestrained so they can utilize their bond issuing power to cheaply raise money, to cheaply and quickly develop renewable energy, allowing us to have a more widely publicly owned grid, while also increasing renewable energy development and also doing it cheaper. Aside from that, we'd also try to focus on what's it called? Let's see. So yeah, we specifically want to make sure it is restrained to renewable energy. Renewable energy would be specifically, what we think of as renewable energy. So we would not be focusing on nuclear, biofuels, or green hydrogen. Let's see, you can go to the next slide. So yeah, so right now they can only sell to government entities. Ideally, we'd like to be able to expand that. We'd like to get to a place where they can not only cover municipal properties, but can sell renewable energy to other customers as well. Ideally, large consumers, eventually like low-income consumers. And by doing that, help lower people's bills directly with renewable energy. Next one. There's also an accountability aspect to this bill that's fairly complicated. I'm not going to go into too much details, but part of it is that we would like to make NYPA a little bit more accountable and transparent as well. Right now, it's largely speaking directly beholden to the governor. We'd like to widen its accountability more. Next slide.
All right, your time is up. You have like one last appeal. Would you like to focus on ESCOs?
And the last aspect of it, someone mentioned ESCOs, which are energy services companies. This bill would explicitly ban ESCOs. Now, ESCOs, largely speaking, are middlemen. If anyone wants to go into the details of why ESCOs are an inefficient way to fight climate change, I'm glad to rant about that another time. But I won't bore you with the details here. But part of this is a phase out of ESCOs, while also trying to restrict competition to community choice aggregation markets, which are like basically like community size choice makers rather than like individual customers. And I'll end it there. In summary, two bills. One of them creates public distribution utilities. The other one allows us to expand public ownership of generation. There still will be private generation. There still is competition within the market. There still is the general structure of how we separate those two things. But ultimately, it's a lot more accountability, a lot more democracy, and a good way to greatly expand the amount of renewable energy cheaply. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Snaps for Steve.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think I can make Hillary's time limit here. I think I got it. So I'm going to go through like overall public power pros. For example, in Texas, I grew up in Texas. Matt's there right now. The grid itself, there are many reasons why Texas really truly screwed people over. Not everybody was screwed over equally. Basically, Austin Utility is an example of a municipally like public power utility. So here, this was like just screenshot headline, right? So Austin Energy customers need not worry about skyrocketing bills. The last sentence, if you can see it there, Austin Energy explains on its website, Austin Energy's base rates are fixed and must be authorized by Austin City Council after a rate review process. Elsewhere in the across the state, we have people who turned out to be victims. I mean, massive snowstorm, people without power, people without running water. I mean, I want to just get into like why public power is a massive benefit, but I also just like my deepest and most sincere like condolences go out to the people who like lost their lives, lost their livelihoods, things like that, like across the state. And as always, like working class BIPOC communities affected the most. And by cutting out the profit incentive, we have direct examples right here of how not everybody was affected equally. For consumers in this other one, like I can't afford this, like you saw that you probably saw headlines about how people got like $15,000 energy bills, things like that. Because when it wasn't regulated in this way, consumers were paying 3.6 cents per kilowatt hour, and it ramped all the way up to 9 per kilowatt hour. So, cool. Yeah. Now, Steve mentioned Nebraska in the chat earlier. Nebraska is an interesting example in that it is the only statewide public power system in the country. So this got that way starting back in 1920. 5% of Nebraskan farms had electricity, only 5% versus 60% of all households. The Nebraska government fought for electricity access for all. FDR was a really strong supporter of this, passed the Rural Electrification Act in 1936, and about 15 years later, less than that, all private electricity providers had already been purchased by public power systems. This isn't like a true like apples to apples, whatever type of situation. But you can see here, like Nebraska, 43rd out of 50 in terms of price per kilowatt hour, New York, top 10. That's bad. Natural gas, similar inverted situation here. Consumption in terms of like overall million British thermal units per capita, opposite ends of the spectrum. Nebraska's top 10 largely because of their industrial sector. Now there's like caveats that I'll admit here in that Nebraska has like 20-something% coal production towards their electricity generation, but they also have like 20% wind. Ultimately, like Nebraskans like love their public power system across the state. It keeps prices low and things running smoothly. Next slide, please. And basically, if you look at the state or like across the nation averages, consumer-owned utilities, as in public power situations, are, they're nonprofits. They're not subject to additional taxes by being a for-profit corporation. They also are not wasting money like focusing on like giving out like dividends to their shareholders and cutting costs that are like safety measures, things like that, or not being subject to citizen-controlled boards. And you can see right here that in the first row, you have public power is 11.8 cents per kilowatt hour average across the country versus 13.5 for all across the US. All right, next slide. And I believe it's my last one, maybe second to last. Basically, you have greater accountability and transparency. Decisions reflect the interests of the community. And there's sunshine laws that basically shine some light on proceedings to be open and readily available to the public. And the last one, reliability. You have far shorter outages in terms of averages, medium, and maximum with public power versus national averages, about half or even less in all situations. So that's it for my pros of public power.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. You almost got the timer. You really did. And I'm going to hold myself to the same accountability. My timer starts now. So at this point, y'all are probably thinking, oh my God, public power is the best thing ever. But we want to talk about maybe a different direction. At the end of the day, I'm going to preface this. I want the same thing you do. I want affordable, renewable energy for the city, for the state, especially for our most vulnerable populations. So could there be a better path to affordable, renewable energy? So first of all, what's the beef with Con Ed? So I would definitely be all in on supporting public power if there was a clear evidence that the path to renewable energy and reduce costs specifically in New York City. However, let's talk about some things Con Ed might be doing right. Right now, they are named the most reliable electricity company in North America by a large margin for several years running. They're ranked number 7 globally and number 2 in the United States for providing solar electricity. According to a 10K SEC filing, which they are bound to by law, they've invested about $3.7 billion in capital expenditures, which goes to infrastructure, maintenance, and renewable energy innovation. Also, they are very transparent. They publish an annual report, the TDFC, which is about climate defense and finance, and the SASB, which is for sustainability, specifically in the utilities industry. Personal anecdote, and I want y'all all to reflect on this, it might be convoluted, but I know Con Ed is expensive. but I don't think many of us have had many problems with turning the lights on. But there is an issue, and that is that New York City has the most expensive energy in the country at 20.1 cents per kilowatt hour. So let's address that. And Matthew already did a bit, but why is it so expensive? So first of all, power has to travel from upstate to downstate. And currently I don't see where public power can actually decrease that cost. Congestion and load also affect the amount we pay. New York City is, as we know, the most dense city in the country by a large margin. Underground maintenance on wires is incredibly expensive and mandated. And rate hikes are largely due in part to agreement to fund additional infrastructure projects, which again, Matt has already talked on. So if public power can bring these prices down, the policy writers need to produce math on how generation, transmission, and distribution could or would be decreased in renewables, because I understand that's what they want, but I'm still not fully seeing a clear path. So New York City is less renewable also because major renewable plants are not directly, you can't really put one directly in the tri-state area. We just don't have the space. So why might public power be the wrong choice? Again, knowing that we still want renewable. First of all, the math doesn't fully add up. There's no concrete numbers to justify overhauling the grid. So comparing apples to corn, New York City is not Nebraska, which has a population of a fraction of any one of our boroughs with about 1.8 million people. Currently, New York State doesn't have the money to buy the whole grid, which is what any bill is proposing, is that we condemn the grid and rebuy it. And a bond is a loan, and we would need to repay back that loan. Taxing the rich may be a solution here, could be applicable for subsidizing low-income power needs. Long Island also did actually try public power and they failed when Sandy hit, and they actually had to sell their grid back to PSE&G. And now it was moot. So like if there's ever an argument against it, it's that we tried and it didn't work. Also, if you have a statewide downstate coalition, you have something that looks like the MTA. And we really want people who run the MTA running our power, which is the thing we rely on every day. Personally, no, I don't know if I want that, especially since Con Ed is pretty reliable in maintaining their lines. This bill would also discourage innovative new renewable companies to provide service to customers. And that's a bad idea because standard renewable projects cannot be put in the tri-state area. So we need innovation from companies. And quite frankly, we're in for a long litigious battle. It's not going to happen overnight. And I think it's one that we won't win. So let's really think about what we do instead, because the government, and we could write policy and leverage the government to do a better job of protecting the people, because there certainly are some issues. So one, investors make 9% return on infrastructure projects. So we could realign investor incentives to make sure that they're really putting their investment money towards renewable infrastructure projects. Executive bonuses are currently tied to investor returns. Simple, decouple them, write a policy. You can't have your bonuses based on investor returns. To generally move towards sustainable energy, we could demand an ESG scorecard from executives to couple their salary with sustainable performance. And finally, power costs are still too high for low income and our most vulnerable populations. Use taxation efforts to subsidize low income power needs. So my final thought with 18 seconds left is our goal is to ensure citizens have access to affordable and renewable power. A transition to public power, I believe, would lead to decades-long battle that would lead to no immediate relief for our most vulnerable populations. And that is the end of that section. And I think I hit it just on time. So we are about to go into breakout rooms. I'm sure y'all have lots of thoughts right now and you are ready to talk about them all. I see the chat has some thoughts going on in it. What we're gonna do is split you into randomized breakout rooms, and you're gonna have 10 minutes to consider the following. What are the pros of public power? What are some cons of public power? Which direction are you leaning, do you think? And what else do you need to know? So your general objectives will be decide what stance you take based on the current information you have. And again, remember, you're voting on, do we want to support public power, not necessarily the DSA bill, or do we think there might be a better path to renewable, affordable energy? And then I want you and your group to try to create a list of 5 questions that you and your group might need to know in order to make a more informed vote. So on that note, Matthew, can you create breakout rooms? But let's take 10 minutes and just open it up. So Matt, can you moderate the chat? And for those of you who have questions, Natalie, you started, so I'll give you the floor first, but any of you who have questions or thoughts, I'd just love to hear them.
I guess we'll just do an asterisk in the chat to get on stack, as we call it.
Well, I mean, I have a lot of questions. How do I, We had a lot of questions in the group, but I'm going to start with one that may be hyper specific, and hopefully that doesn't harm the overall conversation going forward. But in talking about the DSA bill, I noticed that there were a lot of like regulatory clauses, and one of them that caught my eye was that it was anti-nuclear and anti, like, kind of these like halfway renewables. And I don't know if is Steve's still here. I was hoping he maybe do like 30 seconds on why he thinks that that is a necessary part in a bill like this. If that's
I
cool.
had the same question. So if Steve, you're floating around.
Sure. The question is why does it not include nuclear? That's the question.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it's like, why is the definition of renewable what it is?
So, I mean, there's debate around the whole entire nuclear thing. Largely speaking, reserve my opinion here, but like fundamentally why it's not there is because we're trying to focus on traditional renewable energy like wind, solar, tidal, things like that. Also, largely speaking, it's very hard to invest in nuclear. Nuclear is not very popular when it comes to raising bonds for. It also, largely speaking, fundamentally requires a centralization of our grid, which there is a move to modernize grids to make them more democratic, but also more flexible and more adaptive. Large-scale nuclear, unfortunately, makes that harder to do. Personally, I'm not anti-nuclear. I think I am probably in a minority when it comes to environmentalists that are pretty okay with nuclear as a concept. It just doesn't fit here. It doesn't actually make a lot of financial sense or practical sense, unfortunately.
And this is looking forward. This isn't reflective of, you're not trying to propose more regulation on existing generation, right?
This bill would not do that.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate that.
Vika, is you're next on stack.
Hello, everyone. Thanks. Thanks for that amazing presentation. I guess, for me, the most important thing is, the fact that we need to decarbonize our electrical grid by 2030. And so I'm curious, how does the push for public power get us there faster than, I think lower lift solutions that, I think Hillary gave as an examples in her last slide. But you don't have to speak about those solutions specifically, but how does it get there faster than other options we have on the table?
Yeah, one thing I do want to say is this isn't necessarily a question time. This is kind of a time to state your opinion on it, on the public power issue, if you preferred a certain solution or another, but we can also ask questions. So I guess if anyone wants to take that question, what I thought was pretty interesting was on the utility side, banning gas hookups. As a utility, they do have the ability to grant new connections of utilities to buildings, because I've had to apply to it to connect schools to gas and to connect a solar array to a school, and the utility can just say no. So if we have a utility that says no to new gas, that kind of takes care of that. But as for building new renewable energy, new clean energy, I think that I prefer to have the state arrange a bid, like an RFP, that anyone can bid on and compete. And that's what the Office of Renewable Energy Siting is doing right now, in work with NYCerta. I don't know, Steve, you have an opinion on this, or anyone else that wants to weigh in?
I just don't want to take up so much space in the meeting, unless so if someone else wants to take it, please.
Anyone have a view on why public power would make it cheaper or easier? Okay, maybe we
could. So it's something called cost of capital. So when you have to do something like building a lot of something, you need to get money. We live in a capitalist system that functions. There is a cost developed with what's it called, that goes with how you generate that money. Usually it comes from either borrowing or, more often, generating bonds. Now, there are private bonds and there are public bonds. Private bonds tend to be very expensive. Public bonds tend to be a lot cheaper. If we raise money using public bonds, that money's cheaper, therefore making it cheaper to develop that asset. So the cost of capital is lower when you're developing it with a public utility.
Awesome. I think Andrew was next on stack.
Yeah, I just want to state that like I'm pro public power in this situation as one of the presenters, and so like this is one of like the quickest resources to understand the DSA bill in particular. One of the things I dropped in the chat was like a huge list of a million different things, and so and decarbonization is one that is going to come up like as a forum topic. So VCAS's question, awesome, excellent question. That is going to be something that we explore in particular. So there's a link specifically to the DSA bills broken down.
Okay, and Anil was next on stack. Anil.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna like to Vikas's question. This was my understanding, and like correct me if I'm wrong if this is like not accurate, but like I guess thinking about it as like if we think about it as like distribution and generation as like two separate things, and like I guess like with the distribution part, that's more like, you know, just democracy and like making sure it's more I guess locally controlled and accountable, and that's like the benefit there. And then with the generation bill, I think it was mentioned like repealing this restriction on NYPA to like generate or like to on who they're like generating for, and they can then provide it to like basically like scale up their renewables. So like I guess that would be another way that like public power would get us there faster.
Awesome. Thanks, Anil. Gabrielle, you're next. Gabrielle,
I was
deconsolidated.
saying that I mean, in general, public power is the better option. If you, I mean, the profits and the rest of the overhead associated with a private company is just an easy example of waste that you can readily eliminate. It's the same as, you know, like if you switching from private health insurance to Medicare for all, it's the only thing that you're changing is you're getting rid of overhead, you're getting rid of just waste, you're getting rid of a whole wasteful legal structure of the this private corporation that is acting as a middleman, and you're having the people who are using the product or service, you're having them be responsible for managing how they get it. And yeah, if you're talking about getting money, well, first of all, it's a complete lie. You don't generate money through bonds or anything like that. Money is generated, you know, by either the authorities that have fiscal authority. So in the United States, it's either Congress or most of the money in the United States right now is generated by banks. But Congress could increase the amount it generates, and thus you have less provided by banks. And that's why we should have Congress providing the financing. You don't have to use these convoluted systems of bonds and all this nonsense. Congress.
Hey, Gabrielle, I had a few more people on stack, but thanks for talking.
Yeah.
Cecil, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll be really quick. Happy National Book Day, everyone, and happy Thursday. So my group had some really cool questions to come up. One that I want to focus on or just put out there is like the who of the problem. And for me, as someone who works in like government and who was working on a lot of tax credits last year, a lot based in energy, it's really hard to really get to the jurisdictional aspect, like which agency is supposed to like do work on this, especially because like some people have mentioned, there's the multi-layered issue of like the power struggle. And we see it with like Cuomo and de Blasio, like for New Yorkers who watch TV a little too much. But I just want people to take away that there is a promise, I think, or angles, depending on what level you want to take it. The federal government's best with like capital, and I'm learning so much of this. This was a kick-ass presentation, by the way. Learned so much, like light bulbs are flaring everywhere, office is on fire. But like federal government's good with capital. I'm trying to hit the budget and not making the mistake that a lot of, or arguably a mistake, of making the federal government be too specific, because that's when you have the politics and the Congress members and everyone trying to put their specific individual vision into it. The state seems to be a lot better with the authority, since this country like is still like working on civil war era logic and wants every individual state to like take responsibility of its own things. The city is like really interesting. It's an outlier like New York in many ways, but it seems like it's really good for flexibility. And I love the point someone in my group brought up about Rikers Island, like being able to look at creative sources for space and land, and not forgetting that we can use underground space too. There's a reason why air rights is such a big thing right now. Like we don't just need to have like one big contiguous farm. We can look at like how the subway system leases out power lines, or maybe even like, there's a big debate on how air rights could fit into this, if we're allowed to use public space as like mechanical voids in buildings, especially with taller and taller skyscrapers. But yeah, all of those things, like they're all based on who you want to target. And yeah, I love like geeking out over this stuff. So yeah, thank you for all the presenters.
Oh, thank you for joining and sharing your view. So Hillary, we're going to put this to a close, because basically, you know, we could spend some more time saying, people could say some final opinions, thoughts. I was just going to say my, preferred way of implementing public power would actually be on the city level. That's my opinion. I don't think I want to do a board. I think I want it to be structured like the Department of Environmental Protection, which is our water utility. And if the bill could do that, I think that would work. But, I think there's open debate on this. I do support public power. It's just the implementation is the hard part. So yeah. Hillary, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, my general thought is, first of all, just like thank you all for coming and being engaged. I know this was an incredibly dense conversation that went really fast. So thank you all for putting the time in, for staying plugged in, tuned in, and coming up with these thoughtful questions. So we really want to figure out what's next. So if you want to dig into public power more, like Cecil, I'd love to geek out with you and talk to you about it. I think that'd be so fun. We're going to explore resources. So Matt sent, and I think Andrew sent it too, a pretty extensive list of resources. It's also linked in the deck that you now have access to. You can sign up for office hours. So Matt's doing office hours on, explanation of electricity, the DSA bill. Stephen, if you want to offer some office hours, like I'm not going to give up your time, but let me know. You might be a really useful resource. I'm opening office hours for talking about maybe some alternatives to public power to achieve the same goal. Or you can, of course, come to a Q meeting. There are Thursdays at 7, now. And then join us for our next forum. So our next forum is going to be the road to net zero on March 25th. So that's going to be another really interesting conversation, and we hope you can join us. In the meantime, though, we do want you to keep talking about public power, because there is going to be a vote. So make sure to vote. It is linked here again in the deck. I can share it, but you're voting on a Likert scale from 1 to 10. And the 1 is maybe public power isn't for me, and 10 is like, hell yeah, public power. And then show your work. So we're on a sliding scale. You can be somewhere in the middle. That's okay. Just tell us why you're landing there and what you're thinking about in general. Do that, take your time. Voting's going to close mid-May, date TBD, but you have a little bit of time to dig into resources, so don't feel like you have to turn around, do a bunch of reading in the next 24 hours. But again, thank you all so much for coming. I'm seeing some chats. I have no idea what's going on here, but thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing. And
awesome.
If you have questions, sign up for office hours and reach out to us.
Whew. Thank you.